Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us tonight. General election night. Of course, we don't know the results yet, so this is all, we're talking a little bit about the implications of the possible outcome, probable outcome of the elections and the tasks of the left, for the left. We also got a session, two sessions today, two subjects we're discussing. The second subject is the Julian Assange case, which will start hopefully at 8 p.m. So we're going to do 1 hour at looking some of the issues around the general elections. According to the polls yesterday, Labour is at 39%, not quite this 40% achieved by Corbyn in 2017. Anecdotally, though, it looks like quite the low turnout today from what I've seen on social media and what friends tell me, because I'm not allowed to vote, being German and that. Perhaps there's been so much talk about a landslide that people didn't bother to go voting. Plus, there's, of course, as we know, very little enthusiasm about Starmer's Labour Party, Labour government, who's promising really just to carry on representing capital, but slightly less ineffective than the Tories did it over the last 14 years. The exit polls from about 10 p.m. should give us a clearer picture. Now we're going to look at a few issues tonight, starting with Comrade Roger Silverman, who's going to give a general short introduction about what this election result will probably mean and what's the way forward for the left. Thanks for joining us, Roger.
Okay, hi, comrades. First of all, obviously, nobody really would be willing to take the risk of making a prediction of a result when within hours that prediction could be refuted or disproved. Nevertheless, I think we can assume, as Tina said, that there will be a Labour majority, probably a big Labour majority on a low turnout. And in other words, yes, a big victory may be in terms of seats for Labour, but no big victory otherwise. Why? Because if we, again, as Tina said, if we compare the total vote in this election with the votes in 2019, which was quite a low vote, but in 2017 was actually almost a record vote for Labour. I think we can safely say that Starmer is unlikely to be able to accumulate a bigger score in terms of votes than Corbyn did. And particularly, it's a case that might be a big majority in seats. But when you compare the Tory party and the Reform Party votes put together, because in effect, there has been a split in the Tory party. If you look at the opinion polls, in some of them, Tory plus Reform were neck and neck with Labour. So in other words, if that split in the Tory party or in the support for the Tory party had not taken place, then it would be doubtful whether Starmer could achieve a victory at all. But anyway, certainly nothing like so spectacular as is likely to be the case this time, because there's been a realignment in the Tory party. We look, for instance, at Braverman, who's already making approaches to the Reform Party, and that's only the tip of the iceberg. There's obviously much more going on under the surface that we've seen already. The split in the Tory party has already gone a long way. Johnson purged the old patrician establishment kind of tradition of the Conservative Party. He purged the Clark-Heseltine wing and really took the ruthless measures that he needed to do in order to take control of party policy that Corbyn quite conspicuously failed to do in terms of the Labour Party. So what we could be seeing now is a kind of end of centuries of the Tory party. They always boasted the Tory party was the oldest party in the world or the most successful political party in the world and so on. But I think what we're seeing now is that Tory party is over. It's clear that there's going to be a realignment. There's going to be either there'll be a coalition of the Tories with Reform Party, or probably a fusion of the two parties, because why not? Politically, there is really no difference between them. So, in other words, what we're going to see is the end of the Tory party, the end of the old established traditional Tory party. But it will also be the end of the Labour Party too, because I think we can say that with the victory of Labour in this election under Starmer, I think we could almost say it reminds us of that famous quote from Dangerfield's book on the Liberal Party, the strange death of liberal England, when he talked about the 1910 election victory, which was a spectacular victory for the Liberal Party, and he said from that victory they never recovered. And I think we can say it could well be the same thing in terms of the Labour Party, from the point of view of the fact that the Labour Party has lost any kind of element that it ever had before of being a party of protest or a party of resistance or a party of opposition or a party of the working class and so on. And therefore, what will its role be? If the ruling class is turning towards the right, then it will be supporting a Johnson Farage administration and will have no time left for Starmer, who will have done his job as far as they were concerned in destroying the left, than in destroying the traditions of Labour in the past. So actually, the problem is that we have no serious left alternative in the Labour Party or in society generally. We've got Corbyn, etc., who, for all the fact that we love him, nevertheless, it's pathetic because he's got no political stance or no political banner whatsoever. It's quite clear that he's standing in this election as an independent because he's looking for reinstatement into the party. He's thinking that just as they reinstated Ken Livingstone after his expulsion, then the same thing would happen to him because he would have reasserted his right to be a Labour MP by the popular votes that he will hope to have in Islington. But the fact is that there's no way that Corbyn will be readmitted into the party. That's quite clear. And there is just no. If you look at the other left alternatives in the House of Commons and so on, well, I mean, McDonnell and the campaign group, there is not a squeak out of them. There is absolutely no sign of any kind of even token protest vote or expression of criticism in any way of the leadership. There's no left in the Labour Party, so to speak. At the same time, outside the Labour Party, there's nothing spectacular whatsoever. It's all pretty miserable and pretty pathetic. Galloway, I personally think you can hardly call him a left alternative at all. Galloway is competing with the right or with the far right in his policies on so-called woke politics, or his question on immigration and so on. Absolutely shocking and despicable. But in fact, the only way that he distinguishes himself from Farage and from the right is that he's is in terms of foreign policy. And what we can say with that is that Galloway is allied with the Russian and the Iranian ruling classes, where he's allied really with the far right in Britain in foreign policy. And in other words, that he's decided that he's after the Muslim voter base, and in that way he's expressing an opposition to the foreign policy of the ruling class. But that's all. The next but one government, we can say, after tomorrow will be a Johnson Farage coalition. I think that's clear, a fusion, and we'll have a far right government in Britain, as we will probably in the USA and probably in the whole of Europe. It may be not tomorrow. It may take 3 or 4 more years, but that's the direction in which things are going. So harsh times are ahead. It'll be harsh enough under Starmer, but it'll be far more harsh and worse under the far right government, which will replace it. Now, that might sound like a very pessimistic note on which to end. But I think we also have to say it's not necessarily so, because everybody is holding their heads in their hands, saying, "Oh, Le Pen is winning in France, and the AfD is going to join the next government in Germany, and we've got Italy, we've got the Scandinavian countries, we've got the Netherlands, and so on, all with either with far right governments or drifting very near to that, but the fact is that the workers are not defeated. They may be. I think it's not. I think it's not mistaken to say that people like Meloni and Le Pen are fascists, but they cannot impose a fascist program. They don't at this stage have the forces on the ground in society. They've got a passive vote for their parliamentary candidates, but they don't have a street army. They're not taking on the labour movement. They're not taking on the opposition in society in terms of street fighting and so on. Therefore, we can say the workers are not defeated. The workers are not, at least not yet defeated. The decisive battles are still to come. Meanwhile, on the left, as I say, there's no clear alternative now. But I am very firmly and strongly of the opinion, and I know that this is a controversial question, but the trade unions will be forced sooner or later to seek their own political voice. It may not be tomorrow. It may not be within the next 2 or 3 years. It may not be until we get a Johnson Farage type government later. But the unions, the working class, will need to assert its political rights and its political aspirations. And it won't come, I agree, of course, nobody is saying otherwise. It won't come from the union tops, from the Sharon Grahams and the rest of it. But it will come from an irresistible surge from below, from the active militants in the union to say, we need our representation in Parliament. We need our voice to be heard. And it's not, we're being completely muzzled and muffled by the Starmer regime in the Labour Party, and we need to break away from Starmer, just as our forefathers broke away from the Liberal Party in 1900 and said we need our own voice. It might not necessarily be a socialist party to begin with, as the Labour Party wasn't even nominally, but it will be a question of the unions needing a voice in Parliament to defend their rights, to defend basic elementary rights to strike and to campaign for their own objectives and for the needs of their workers. So I think this is the way forward. It's not a very optimistic scenario in the short term, but in a longer term, I think we have everything still to hope for and to fight for and to campaign for. But I do want to make a little plug that the organisation or the front, the campaign that I'm associated with, along with some other comrades, called the Campaign for a Mass Workers' Party, will be holding a discussion meeting on the 9th of July. I think that's Tuesday, and everybody is welcome as a forum just to discuss the way forward. So anyway, thanks, comrades. That's just some ideas. I know that they'll be controversial, and I'm hoping that I can learn from the points that the comrades would like to make.
Thanks, Roger. Just to pick you up on a couple of things, the Labour Party and the Tory Party are both dead, but they're not really dead. You said, I mean, you call them, they're both dead, but then you kind of went on to describe that they are realigning, which I think those parties have done over the last 150 years, haven't they? I mean, that's not a new thing, right? That they change alliances, etc.
Well, I think the what I'm trying to say is that the old traditional Tory party is gone, and the old Labour Party is gone, and we're in new territory in a way.
Okay,
anyway,
well, we can discuss that later. Yeah. I wonder when the Labour Party was not, reactionary and right wing. I mean, it's always had a pretty a big right wing trend. To discuss this issue now further, Ian, hello, comrade. Let's look at the Labour Party then. And sort of in the run up to the elections, I think there kind of, you could see two extremes really on the left, really. You've had a sort of auto-Labourite, perhaps it could be described, who have said, you have to vote Labour now, a bit like 1997, you have to vote for Tony Blair, because after the elections, a bit similar to what Roger's saying at the end there, the unions will then sort of break with Labour, and there's a crisis of expectations, etc., and something will happen. On the other side, you had a sort of even stranger view, which I find very difficult to get my head around, is that the Labour Party is now the biggest enemy of the working class, bigger than the Tory Party, bigger than reform, bigger than capitalism itself, which is also quite popular on the left. Where do you see the role of the Labour Party at the moment, comrade?
I think it's fair to say, and I wouldn't put it any further than this, that at the moment, the Labour Party is the preferred party of the bourgeoisie. And it's not the first time. I mean, when Tony Blair was elected, the Financial Times, the House Journal of the bourgeoisie, called for a Labour victory then. And if you look at the Financial Times today, whilst it doesn't openly call for a vote for Labour, there's quite clear prescriptions on the part of the Financial Times for things that it would like a Labour government to do. Rejoin the European Union, for example, create the conditions for that to take place. So, while I mean, the enemy of the working class is the bourgeoisie, and the fact that the bourgeoisie at the moment is prepared to support the Labour Party is because of the very nature of the Conservative Party. But there's something else. And it's we're still living with the reverberations of the collapse of the Soviet Union. The coming into being really of social democracy, of social democratic parties that would administer capitalism in a way which is, in a sense, takes the rough edges off of capitalism, as we saw in the period after the Second World War, is really that period where social democracy had its strength. So, concessions made to the working class, such as an NHS, a welfare state, council housing, and all those things, were in part a response to the possibility that there was an alternative. Where we don't see the possibility of an alternative, what we're left with is naked class struggle. Who is best placed to wage that naked class struggle? I mean, the Conservative Party has obviously formed. It will engage in naked class struggle against working people. But who does it really represent now? It clearly doesn't represent all sections of the bourgeoisie. The fractures in the bourgeoisie itself has led to its expression within the collapse of the Conservative Party. So what we're left with then is a Labour Party that will that will serve the interests of the bourgeoisie. But of course, it can't do that without some degree of credibility. It can't do that without some degree of relationship. I mean, that's how it's worked in the past, where it's been prepared to marshal the working class behind the interests of capital. Can it continue to do that, or will the social relations that we see become so transparent that actually workers have no choice but to fight back? And that means not just within the trade unions, but transforming the trade unions. I don't believe for one moment that Wes Streeting is going to make any concessions, for example, to the junior doctors or any other group of health workers. I don't believe that any serious group of Labour MPs will do anything about trying to turn back any of the anti-union legislation that has been enacted by both Tory and Labour administrations. So, whilst I'm not saying that the Labour Party is the problem, I'm saying that the Labour Party at the moment is the preferred party of the bourgeoisie, and the working class has no choice but to fight. But in the words of Harold Macmillan, events, dear boy, events. And there are other things going on in the world. whether the movement to war continues to be inexorable is a good question, isn't it? We can see the war in Ukraine is going to be dragging on for some considerable time to come. Will that mean at some point Ukraine will come to a settlement with Russia, which will almost certainly mean that Russia will keep any gains it has? Is NATO prepared, for example, to therefore be seen to have been defeated by Russia? Will the Ukrainian resistance collapse and from that point of view force a NATO intervention? These are all imponderables and I can't predict any of them. But the idea that things will just remain static and just be easily managed by a Starmer administration is just completely fanciful. There will be constant changes. What we've already seen in Palestine, for example, is effectively genocide in real time and Starmer complicit in it, along with the US administration. And that has had a global impact. So my feeling is that workers will have to fight because the response to those events will be cuts in workers' pay, will be an intensification of the class struggle. Even if at the moment it doesn't look as if workers are preparing to fight back, I think it's inevitable.
Thanks, comrade. What's your view of the left then? I mean, we are quite united in our disdain of the Labour Party. You can't organize in the Labour Party anymore. How should the left organize? Should we hope the unions do something, or would whatever they set up would be pretty dire, wouldn't it?
We've no choice but to work within the unions, just as we've no choice but to engage with, one way or the other, with whatever groupings are thrown up in the period after. But I think it's imperative that Marxists, communists, stand as communists and put forward the arguments that were put forward by Marx and Engels. Arguably, we don't have much going for us, but we do have our ideas. The various crises that have taken place within capital have only really been explicable in terms of a Marxist perspective. And from that point of view, if we'd remained true to that, then there's some hope of that paying off. That doesn't mean to say we can't operate within another organization, but we should do it openly. We should do it with a clear program of our own, and we should do it with the aim of the radical transformation of society. Anything else, any other kind of sordid compromise, or anything else on the basis of a Labour Party 2.0 is not only doomed to failure, it'll be another decade wasted.
Do you see then a move towards something like that? Like there was a Socialist Alliance in 1997. I mean, there seems nothing on the horizon like that at the moment, is there?
Well,
that wasn't that great.
Well, I mean, historically, the original Communist Party of Great Britain, of course, came into being by a whole range of different groups coming together and unifying in 1920. There's no reason why that couldn't happen. I think the thing that will drive it forward is the proletariat itself. If the proletariat exists only at the moment as a kind of nascent class, a class, as it were, waiting to come into being to realize itself for itself, then any attempts to kind of preempt it necessarily struggle. That doesn't mean to say we don't do anything while we're waiting. We have to form a party. We have to do the hard yards of patient education and agitation and all the rest of it. We have to try and understand the present. The numbers of people who are prepared to actually sit down and do the work of understanding contemporary political economy, for example, all of which is necessary to understand what we do in the future, to prepare ourselves. I mean, people are very fond of talking about learning the lessons of history. I mean, having a party that's prepared and ready to take on that challenge is going to be the crucial thing. And again, it won't happen in a kind of Labour Party 2.0. Even if what you can end up with is just simply people chasing an electoral chimera in the hope of getting a few seats here or there. Absolutely fine to stand, but one has to stand in a principled way and argue for communism, not argue for state socialism or municipal socialism or some kind of nationalization of the top 200 companies or some silly formulation of that nature. The fact is that working class has to take power, and it has to take power not just take control of the state or take control of the street, but actually has to seize control of its own means of production. It is about the common ownership of the means of production, not the state ownership. And naturally, our state, the state that we will need to keep the old ruling class under control, will be something that will be forged in revolution, but it will have to play a full role. But it can't be just about letting the state do it for us, as it were. That's been the historic folly of the Labour Party.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian. Comrades, if you have any questions or disagreements, even better, ask them after our last speaker, Matthew, who's going to take a look at what's going on in the US specifically, because that will also have major implications on what's happening in Britain. Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah, thanks, comrades. No, I think it's important, actually, in the light of the decision this week of the Supreme Court to declare essentially a presidential dictatorship in the US. It's a very, very significant move. I think there's, you can go back over a whole period in these terms in understanding, what the move in the US. I think it's particularly important, of course, because the US is the global hegemon. It actually controls, the operation of the imperial system and capital across much of the world. And so, I mean, what happens in the US is actually then reflected in the rest of the world. And the fact that the US ruling class is moving rapidly against, even the sort of forms or appearance of democracy is incredibly important to everybody. It should be seen as that. And the thing is, in these terms, you can look at it. I mean, very briefly, I think there's the importance of this is to look at there's three decisions of the Supreme Court in recent times which are extremely important. I think the other thing, of course, is that the ruling class has moved away from politics. I mean, in terms of openly use of the political machine towards the use of the courts, because obviously that can be done without any issue, and could be done as a form of autocracy and so on. And therefore the use of the court, particularly the Supreme Court, has been increasingly important in terms of the running of the state itself. And you can go back over decades in these terms, and things like obviously the handing over the presidency to Bush Jr. and so on, which was a complete fix. Again, abrogating democracy. But I think, as I say, the three important ones recently, of course. First of all, a thing called Citizens United in 2010, which effectively what that did was to openly allow the ruling class to buy elections and to buy all the political representatives, or supposed political representatives, because what it did is it lifted all limits in terms of money being pumped into any election that people fancied being involved in. So therefore, the ruling class could seize control of the entire process. And so you can track, the elected representatives, nationally elected representatives in the US are generally dependent on their donors, and you can track that. Say, for instance, Marco Rubio, people may have heard of in Florida, his entire political career is based on being financed by Florida's largest car dealer. These people are owned nakedly, and that is, where we're at. And you can see the thing is, if you look at the crisis at the moment over Biden, the fact, will he or won't he stand in November? And the people who make the decision, actually, of course, will be his donors. The people who say, well, we give you money or not give you money. And those people will make the decision as to whether or not he stands. And that's how the fight is at the moment. It's nothing to do with any form of function of the Democratic Party. It's actually to do with his donors. So Citizens United in that terms is extremely important. The second one, of course, also, of course, what you're seeing is a conversion of the Supreme Court, the packing of it with effectively people who are right-wing maniacs, unhinged in many cases, who are corrupt, deeply corrupt. And you can look at, there's been exposure, of course, in Politico in particular, the publication Politico, of all the bribes that have been given, particularly to Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. These people just accept money, and basically say, well, there's no limit to what money and so on and so forth that we can accept, because there's no way we're appointed for life and we don't give a shit. So in those terms, you can produce this incredibly reactionary majority on the court, which can do what it wants, and essentially changing the nature of the actual system itself. The second decision, I think, which is important, is obviously Dobb recently, which 2021, I think, which is the decision to abolish the right to abortion, which have been held for 50 years. And essentially is a misogynist attack on all the rights of women in the US, because opening from that is then a whole series of other things, like the right to contraception, the control of your own body and all this sort of thing, and these people are desperate to push forward that misogynist attack on the majority of the population, which is incredible. The third one is the one that was just been enacted, which is the case Trump v. the US, basically to say, does the president have immunity for his acts? Now, of course, historically, if you go back to the actual Constitution as it was written in the 18th century, of course, they specifically said, no, this is not the case. Obviously, the president is no different to anybody else. They stand before the law as anybody else does, and all this sort of thing. We're against kinship and any of this other stuff, because obviously we want a democracy, and we want to be rid of autocracies of all sorts. Now, what the court has just done is to say, okay, well, yes, the president is immune for everything they do as president. There's no real limit, and that includes, of course, killings, which is not. It's not unprecedented, obviously. Obama's, for instance, efforts to kill people with drones. Which, of course, is in itself actually in US law illegal. Assassination in US law is illegal. However, of course, they never bothered enforcing that one either. But he did actually kill a US citizen, because obviously, the citizens of the rest of the world don't really count in this, but the US citizens are important. So he did kill a guy called Al-Awlaki by drone. And of course, there was no repercussions of that. Trump himself actually, of course, carried out an assassination. Guy you may have seen this case, a guy called Michael Raynell, who was an anti-fascist in Portland, and essentially they said, well, they said to the cops, right, go and kill this guy. And they did. Okay, the cops kill a lot of people in the US, but actually the president say, you go and kill that guy, is a different thing. So what you wind up with now is a situation in which what you're saying is anything the president wants to do, whether that's accept bribes, kill people, enact any kind of repression, and whatever else he wants to do, is up to him. So essentially, what you're saying is that person is a dictator. Whoever holds the office is a dictator. There's no accountability. There's no terms of democracy and all the rest of it. That's extremely significant. that changes the nature of the system, and we move towards, away from, any kind of democracy or accountability and all this, the checks on the system, and towards obviously Bonapartism, a form of Bonapartism and state. And okay, people can argue, and rightly, obviously, that the US has been enacting, mass killings in large sections of the world, and it was, of course, Johnson in the 60s, of course, who said, well, that Kennedy has been, his predecessor, and old Muckachum Kennedy had been running the CIA like Murder Incorporated, until he was knocked off. So these things have been going on for a long time. But the point being is it now winds up in the States, and it now winds up in a situation where, we move towards a dictatorship. That, of course, will have an effect across the rest of the world. Because clearly, obviously, the contradictions are getting to the point where the system requires to use these forms of repression and to stand above any form of accountability. And also, of course, I mean, the drive to war is extremely unpopular. There's no popularity for war. You can see it anywhere. Whether that's the Ukraine war, in which people don't want to get involved or die in that war. Whether that's the genocide in Gaza, which is universally loathed, virtually. Obviously, watching that on your phone or your computer live, the genocide. It's something that causes revulsion. But obviously, these things have to be, as far as the ruling class, these things have to be carried out. And therefore, they're required to move to a dictatorship form. And so we're going to see more of this, basically, in the rest of the world. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. One question to you then. The Trump-Biden debate was, of course, interesting in how bad it was, and how the Democrats are now seriously worried about Trump winning again, and it does look quite likely. I mean, that was a shit show, wasn't it? That Biden is clearly not doing very well. There's the issue of Israel-Palestine is quite important to socialists, of course. I mean, Biden is bad enough, but he has, put a little bit of pressure on Netanyahu to, don't just kill tons and tons and tons, or to rail it down a little bit. Trump, on the other hand, is a total hawk when it comes to Israel, and he said in that debate, Netanyahu should do what he wants. He should basically destroy Gaza. He should basically destroy the West Bank. And maybe is it in response to that? Do you think that Trump looks like a possible president again? That actually the situation now is that Starmer, who has, owing to pressure from below, perhaps decided to say that there should be a recognition of the Palestinian state, whatever that state's supposed to be, because if you look at the map, there is no possibility of a state of the Palestinians. But he's now delaying that again. Do you think he's reacting to that possibility that he's going to have to do deals with President Trump again?
Well, the problem is that they're stuck, aren't they? Because the Israelis basically are losing. I mean, whatever. I mean, the cost is horrible, but they're losing. They can't actually win. They can't get rid of Hamas. Hamas is too well organized, and the rest of it. They carry on fighting. Obviously, the Israelis carry on trying to wipe out large sections of the population of Gaza by whatever means. Now, of course, Biden, of course, is actually equally responsible for this as Netanyahu. If you go back to the White House logs on the 8th of October, Biden telephoned Netanyahu and said, "Yeah, I will give you everything you want." And they did, and they have, and they've run this massive airlift, which runs actually through, parts of it are actually run from the use of the British bases in Cyprus. So the British are actually complicit in this too, and they're supplying these massive airloads of bombs, weapons, armored vehicles, everything that the Israelis use. So virtually everything that's been dropped on or fired at Gaza has come from the US, and they know that. I mean, they're not stupid. so in those terms, I mean, okay, the problem for the Israelis really is that that they are not equipped to run a long war either. I mean, historically, the Israelis always run short wars because they understand, they're more sensible and understand they can't run a long war. So if they say, I mean, the big thing is, do they go for a war against Hezbollah? I mean, obviously, Hezbollah doesn't really want a war, and they have spent their time launching missiles, rockets, etc., over the border, but they don't really want a straight-up conflict. But the thing is, they can't. There's no way. I mean, Hezbollah spent 20 years digging into southern Lebanon. You could coat the place with explosives, and they've dug in deep enough that they wouldn't make any. Wouldn't stop them. Last time the Israelis tried invading southern Lebanon, they did so badly. It took 2 weeks to get some of their units out to the positions they got to. They lost a lot of material and a lot of men. And then, it's unlikely they can actually carry out what they want to do. Even and the problem is, okay, I mean, even if you said, well, okay, the lunatics, like the Smartrishes and the Ben Gavirs are going to take over, then I mean, the whole thing will fall apart. The other thing, of course, is that people are leaving. The other problem with the Israelis, of course, is there's a steady stream of people out of the place because obviously people can see, why are we going to say that? So in those terms, yeah. I mean, the problem, obviously, the problem exists for the rest of the imperialists as well. So you see this sort of, I mean, Starmer's first reaction, I think, was the effort to try and stop the Palestine demo on the 6th, because the Met, for the first time, tried to dispute the permit for that. Now, eventually, they got that. We've seen, obviously, the repression in the rest of Europe, but the problem is the genocide is incredibly unpopular. As you would see, hope of the rest of it. The fact you can see, people being wiped out live, due to some incredibly courageous Palestinian journalists. People would it's a revolting thing, and people don't want it and they don't want to see it. And so, I mean, in those terms, it's very, very difficult for them to actually make it to maintain the position of dominance of the Israelis, and to actually carry on supporting this thing. We see increasing repression in obviously in the likes of Germany, where they now said to anybody who hasn't got a German passport, look, if you so much as say anything against Israel, we'll fling you out of the country tomorrow. And basic things. I mean, we've seen the same. Well, not almost the same in France. So the degrees of repression are getting worse, but it doesn't solve the problem.
No, and as the only ally of the US in the Middle East, the only reliable ally, they will continue to support Israel for the foreseeable future. Comrades, if you have questions or comments on either of the issues raised now, please click raise hand. Roger wanted to come back on something, and I give Ian a chance as well, and then with Victor with his hand up. But if anybody else would like to say something before we turn to Assange, please click raise hand.
Yes, thanks, Tina. First of all, I have to apologise to comrades. I have to leave soon because I'm supposed to be at the count for my constituency. I'm in the team of our exemplary candidate, I have to say, Steve Headley, who is chair of our local trades council, as well as being a former leader of the RNT, and who's actually conducted an exemplary campaign. So I have to leave in a minute, and I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, I agree with what Ian said in the chat about the reason for the decay and the decline, morally, if you like, as well as politically, of the Tory party. It is a question not just of the shift from industrial to the financial wing. I mean, what happened is there is in effect no industrial wing now left in Britain. But it's not even under Thatcher we had the shift to the City of London as the main centre the ruling class in Britain. But now it's not even that. It's the absolute scum, the hedge fund managers, the speculators, the black money brigade. I mean, that it's actually criminals who are really the leading faction in the ruling class in Britain at the present time, and that accounts for the drift of the Tory party towards the xenophobic, Faragist policies that they have. And I do think we're going to see a fusion after all, it's quite a recent split in a way, but a unification of the Tories with the Farage wing. And on that basis, they've already done very well in this election. I think they may not have had a majority, but they certainly wouldn't be anything like a landslide victory for Labour, and it may not even be a landslide victory. We'll know in a few hours. But so that is one point. But I wanted to say really the main points that Ian was saying. Absolutely right. Well, the Labour Party is not enough. We know that. We know we all are agreed. I think we're all agreed in this meeting on the need for communism, on the need for dictatorship of the proletariat, of the and all that implies. But what we're not talking about our own wishes. We're discussing perspectives. You can't operate seriously as a political force and as a revolutionary force if you don't take into account the actual perspectives as they're likely to unfold out of the social situation we're in at the present time. And I am saying, and I may be wrong, maybe I've got the perspective wrong on this, but I believe that what we're going to see, and it's something which nobody else seems to give any attention to whatsoever, but I think we are going to see a move over the time of a Starmer government, and maybe it might be delayed a little longer under a Johnson Farage government, but that we will see a move of the trade unions to say we need a party of our own. We need a party which is going to fight for our interests, not the revolutionary policy necessarily to begin with. But the point is that they will want to form a party to represent the basic rights and the basic interests of trade unionists, which means to withdraw their labour, to bargain, collective bargaining, all the other things that come from that. That is something which is likely to happen. We may prefer that instead of that, they just bypass that and there's a mass revolutionary uprising. But I think it's more likely that it will take these kind of distorted forms on the route towards that objective. And that's the point. We have to say what is likely to happen and how we orient ourselves to the likely course of events. Now, what did Lenin say when the Labour Party was formed? Before it even adopted a nominally socialist constitution in 1918, from before that, Lenin was arguing in favour of the Labour Party achieving affiliation towards the Socialist International, towards the Second International, because when other people objected that it was not a party along, didn't have the principles of the Socialist International, that it didn't recognise the class struggle, and Lenin's aphorism in reply, something we always need to remember, is he said, no, the Labour Party may not recognise the class struggle, but the class struggle will recognise the Labour Party. And that's why we should be in favour of its affiliation to the Socialist International. And what he meant was that it would be forced by events to take a class position and and even at least nominally a socialist position. And that is what happened in 1918 under the impact of the revolutionary wave sweeping Europe at the end of the First World War, and under the impact particularly of the Russian Revolution, and under the impact of the mass movements, for instance, of the dockers to refuse to load munitions onto the Jolly George, which was the ship carrying arms to the counter-revolution in the civil war in Russia. It was on in that basis that the Labour leaders, I know what they were like, I know that they were reformists and so on, but they had to make concessions towards that surge of revolutionary feeling among the masses, and that was when they adopted Clause 4. And the point is that Lenin said to the communists there, all of whom remember the early communists in Britain in around 1920, 21. And they said, no, we're not going near the Labour Party. It's a bourgeois party and all the rest of it. Something we hear very much today as well. I mean, the Labour Party has changed in any case. That's another issue. But when there is a reconstituted movement towards the creation of a new party of Labour, which is what I'm expecting to happen in the next 3-4 years, then it would be absolutely incumbent, I think, on revolutionaries to join it. Not to have illusions in it, not to support its false utopian and reformist program and all the rest of it, but in order to campaign and to win support for communist ideas. And that's all I'm saying. And I think that is a very, very optimistic prognosis. I think that's something which we can look forward to with great hope and enthusiasm. So that's it.
Thanks, Roger. Ian, I'm going to take in quickly Victor and Steve, and then you can come back after them. I hope that's okay. Victor, you first.
I wanted to say something glaringly obvious about the contradictory. It used to be a white, stale, mainly male, middle-aged and elderly-led major right, hard right party. I say major right, hard right because the characters that led it, Ken Clark, he liked to have some whiskey when he gave his budgets. So he slashed a few hospitals and closed them down in order to reduce the price of. And from then on, they funded their tax cuts for their business pals by cutting benefits for the poor and for the sick. We had Cameron and Osborne who said we're all in it together. And then they continued the attacks on the poor and the sick in order to fund tax cuts for big business. And that is what happened when it was led by these style male whites, Clark, Hunt, Major John, George Osborne, etc. Since then, largely due to Boris Johnson, who actually is part Turkish, the Conservative Party has had a more multiracial leadership. It has started to suggest.
Could you wind up a little bit? Go a bit faster, please. Sorry, we don't have that much time. We have to finish by 8.
It suggested more humane policies like building hospitals, looking after the elderly when they're old, and that kind of thing, and even raising taxes to fund it. Regrettably, Sunak has brought back Cameron and Jeremy Hunt, and now they're back on tax cuts again and shafting the poor and the sick to pay for them. But I think that's what's changed in the Tory party. It's had a more multiracial leadership, which oddly has turned out to be more anti-immigrant than the male style lot who saw immigration as a way of getting cheap labour and therefore favoured it more. Thank you. Sorry to take so long.
No, thank you. We just we only have an hour today before the next speaker comes. Steve, please, and then back to Ian.
I don't think it's about the crimes and wickedness of various parties. What we should be looking at is the contradictions in the way that the society is unfolding before our eyes, and see what's coming out of those contradictions, what's old and dying and what's new and emerging. That's what we need to see. Now, Matthew gave us, I mean, I didn't really rate anything that the comrade said about Britain. I wasn't really taken by that, because it's still working in the frame of reference of how the Labour Party was in the 20th century, in the 21st century, or whatever, and it's still fit there. But what Matthew told us was that there was a crisis of democracy. There was a crisis of democracy in America, which was reflected in Trump winning an unexpected election victory, which nobody expected him to do, because so many people who were working class people, many of them were pissed off with the way things were working out in America. and they liked his brand of nationalism. That then went on to the Trump coup, where Trump tried to overthrow an election result, and now it's gone on to this literally a constitutional crisis that Matthew outlined so well. If you want to look at that, where is that likely to be heading? It's heading towards a civil war, I think. I mean, it's not there yet. I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow, but that's how the crisis of America is going to. Maybe it's like 1865 all over again. I don't know. But I think you can look at that and say, well, what's the parallel here? Because I think you can see the parallel here is that we've got a crisis of democracy here. And nobody in any of the parties I've seen, Galloway, I've looked at all their programs, none of them have discussed the crisis of democracy. They're literally the bankruptcy of the Westminster parliamentary system. And that system works differently in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England. And nobody seems to mention that. Our political system and constitution is a state of decay and literally putrefaction, because the post-war social monarchy has literally collapsed or been hollowed out under our eyes. So we've got a complete and utter bankruptcy. So we're into new territory in that sense. Something old is dying in our political system, and we don't quite know how it's going to die. The Tories look like they might have just hit death right now, but I think the Labour could also hit death soon as well. I don't think whatever majority they get. Hello, Marcus, by the way, just as I thought. So Marcus, hi, Marcus. I couldn't, as I saw you, I thought I would stop my speech to say hello to Marcus. But anyway, but with something
generally get to the point.
Yes, okay, generally get to the point. Okay, the general point is that what we're seeing now, which is new, is the beginning or the rise of English nationalism. So we've got the extreme centre, which Tariq Ali called it, the Labour and Tory extreme centre. Then we've got the rise of English nationalism. And on the other side of that contradiction is I would say, the missing English republicanism. There is no idea of what a new democracy could look like in this country. Look at the programs of the parties that have been standing. So what we've got, Tina, is a choice between a kind of left populist mass party, that's what they're looking for, and having a small communist sect that just simply, I don't know, I can see you smiling now, Tina, a small communist sect outside this, simply preaching pure communism on the outside of all of that, and simply condemning the mass politics. So Roger was right in one sense what he said, but he conceives of a mass party only as an economistic party whose program is limited to trade unionism, more or less. Well, that's hopeless as well. The problem with the English left there, or left in England, not English left, left in England, is all of these perspectives are completely out of kilter with where we've got to. They're all looking back to where we were before, and we've left that behind. So we need a new approach, and I think this general election will highlight some of that. The gap on the left is massive. We'll finish there, Tina, then in that case.
Okay, I don't think anybody wants to build a communist sect.
No, well, you wouldn't want to build a sect, Tina, if I could say that. But you might conduct those politics in a sectarian way that leads you into remaining within a small sect. Would lead you on to do that.
Okay, thanks, Steve. Paul wants to say something quickly, and I think his camera doesn't work. And then bring in Ian, and then we start the second part of our session. Paul.
Yeah, hi. Just on the question of the trade unions building a new party or political representation, I personally, I don't see that. I think like the particular formation of the Labour Party happened in Britain and not anywhere else, and outside of an actual movement of a mass movement of the class, I see the trade unions just negotiating here and there, and with whoever's around. I think, I don't know if it's fanciful, but I just don't see it myself. On a question of how big the Labour vote in this election is going to be, I mean, it just struck me that some of the polls have been talking about 38%, 40% I've seen, and that opens up quite an interesting talking point in terms of, that was the same as Corbyn got in 40%, and the whole point was to make it electable. And with the Tories being smashed, I wonder if we'll see the Tories fighting for PR in the next election, and and a notion that the electoral arithmetic's been messed up, and that may well lead to I don't know, the Tories bringing up stuff that we hadn't anticipated. I just wondered about, nobody's talked about the RCP campaign. It'll be interesting to see how they do they're standing against Steve Headley, and that kind of links into perhaps the question about what we're trying to do. Are we trying to sort of fight for the sort of Labour Party Mark II model, or promoting using elections to promote Marxist politics?
Thanks, Paul. Ian, you have the final word. Sum up the discussion if you like, and respond to some of those issues, please.
Extremely quickly, because I think it's important we get on and listen to Marcus. I just wanted to make a point about race. People have talked about race, and race will be an issue not only in this campaign, but will come up again and again. And the only response to that has to be socialist internationalism and a rigorous assertion of the importance of a worldwide socialist society. And that means not getting into the numbers game. It means not playing a nationalist card, because after all, the bourgeoisie doesn't care what kind of skin you've got. It'll exploit you whoever you are, just as it doesn't really care what gender you are. Racism is not, except under certain circumstances, used by the bourgeoisie to control the population. It is from time to time, as we saw, for example, in South Africa and in the British Empire. But it isn't an official kind of part of the ruling class ideology today. But it is used, of course, by sections of the ruling class for their own nefarious purposes. But the only response to that cannot be, has to be socialist internationalism, and not to pander to it and go along with it. Okay, that's all I have to say.
Didn't want to say anything about the communist sect.
No. As someone very happy to be aligned with the Communist Party of Great Britain, the Communist Party of Great Britain will only be really a communist party when the proletariat comes into being. And in the meantime, we're preparing ourselves.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ian. It was a short discussion, and we're suffering from the situation that we don't actually know the outcome yet. We know what's probable, but we don't quite know. But there are lots of challenges for the left, and we touched on some of them. I guess we can't force the issue. We might wish for the trade unions to build a party. Some of us do. We might wish for a communist party to arise, but it is really, as Ian just said at the end, it is really up to the working class what's going to happen. Just wishing it so is not going to make it so. So good to start now a second part of our evening. Thanks very much for joining us, Marcus. I haven't seen him for 25 years or something like that. He's in Australia, 5 a.m. Thank you very much for getting up quite so early to be with us for an hour. We want to look at the Julian Assange case, not the detailed case of not the details of the case, but also chiefly the implications of what it means for information and the media, journalism, free speech in particular, under late stage capitalism, imperialism. Marcus is a journalist in Australia. He's a member of the Australian Labor Party, was a former Labor Party press secretary, and was a former president of the Journalists Union in Australia. So I'm sure you have lots of insights. Thanks for joining us. About 20-25 minutes, and then we can have questions and contributions from the floor, I'd say. Thank you.
Thank you, comrades. It's great to be joining you from chilly, rainy Sydney at 5 o'clock in the morning. Reminds me of London summers. I think it was interesting. A comrade there just said that they thought that the Labor Party in Britain was a unique development. Of course, the Australian Labor Party is also a very similar type of organisation built on the trade unions here. So I really want to present this short talk in two parts. First, I'll just look at the founding and politics of WikiLeaks and around Julian Assange, WikiLeaks aims and some thoughts about the nature of information under capitalism. And then I'll take a bit of a broader look at who controls information, who owns it, and raise some questions about program privacy and social media. As president of MEA, MEAA stands for the Media Entertainment Arts Alliance, which is a union that covers journalists, actors, crew, and musicians. There was a period of forced amalgamations of unions under a previous Labor government, and we were jokingly referred to as the Clowns and Jugglers Union when we were all forced together. But anyway, we look after the arts. I'm no longer president. I'm just a rank and file member there. So Julian Assange has been a member of my union since 2007. When really WikiLeaks kicked off. WikiLeaks as a project, though, was many years in gestation. Julian Assange registered the domain wikileaks.org in 1999, but it wasn't first really used until 2006. WikiLeaks was formally launched in 2007, the year he joined my union. The inspiration for WikiLeaks reportedly, and a lot of this is secondhand stuff, I don't know Julian Assange, but I do know some of the, I know the editor-in-chief, Kristen Truffson, and a few other people are involved. So the inspiration was reportedly the publication of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg in 1971, which of course revealed the secret history of US involvement in the Vietnam War from 45 to 68. Those papers revealed the US knew it could not win the Vietnam War. The US government had been systematically lying to the population. And in that, it was revealed that the actual war aim of the Vietnam War was to contain China, which sounds rather familiar at the moment, doesn't it? At the launch, WikiLeaks proclaimed, quote, "The method is transparency, the goal is justice." And Assange said it was important not to confuse the goal and the method. In my article in Weekly Worker recently, I said that WikiLeaks' general approach could be described as techno-anarchism. I think that's a pretty straightforward. What I mean by that is using technology, WikiLeaks aims to disrupt power structures of the establishment to give ordinary people access to the hidden information of the state. And this will spontaneously, I suppose, empower people to make radical change once the scales fall from their eyes. Or 2011, at a speech in London to a demonstration, Assange had said, "If wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth." I rewatched that speech last night, my time. It's quite interesting in the context of him being released. He said he did want to see radical change. He also said Thatcher was right. There is no longer any society. There's just a transnational security elite carving up the world using your tax money. And to change that, we must not just petition governments, we must take them over by forming our own networks of strength and mutual value. Sounds very anarchistic to me. And I don't mean that as an insult, of course, I just mean that as a political program. He said, quote, "Wars are a result of lies. The Vietnam War was a result of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, a lie. Iraq War, a result of lies. Wars in Somalia, results of lies." Interestingly, he said the Second World War and the German invasion of Poland as a result of carefully constructed lies. So, I mean, I'm sure that was hyperbole for the speech, but it does sort of reveal a lack of understanding of historical and class forces that lead to such conflict. He seems to say that wars come as a result of lies peddled by the media, and that reality is constructed by liars. For him, this should make us optimistic, because he said if wars can be started by lies, peace can be started by truth. So that is our task, to reveal the truth. It's worth going back further to remember Assange came from the hacker community. I actually knew people who knew him when he was at university. He didn't finish university in Melbourne. As a teenager, he was a hacker using the handle Mendax. he broke into the Pentagon as a teenager, and possibly NASA, although that's never been proven or admitted. He was caught and charged and let off pretty lightly, given his age, and I don't think there was anything particularly mendacious, despite being Mendax. In the early 90s, he actually cooperated with police to assist their child exploitation unit to uncover serious sex crimes and child exploitation online in the 1990s. But of course, WikiLeaks, after it launched, is best known for its release on the 5th of April for collateral murder. This was followed in October that year of Cablegate that showed the extensive war crimes by the US and its allies in Iraq, and later revealed crimes in Afghanistan as well. 14 years, I won't go into all the legal ups and downs of his case. That's well documented, although still a lot of lies and misinformation pushed like that around that. So Assange really is a modern day man in the iron mask, hidden by the regimes for 14 years as an example for us all not to overly embarrass the empire. But as a result of his extensive detailing of war crimes, of a secret state, you could almost say, at which the masses are well aware of, this is now common information. Has empire crumbled? No, it certainly hasn't. I would say power structures of imperialism have not shifted at all, really, because of these revelations by WikiLeaks. I think they have given us some campaigning. I think in Australia, and can't remember the election, there was briefly a WikiLeaks party that actually unsuccessfully stood in the Senate here. So I'd say that while those at the center of the WikiLeaks campaign are extremely intelligent, dynamic, interesting people, they were very dogged and courageous in the long-term campaign to have Julian released. I'd say there's sort of an outer layer of perma-campaigners for Julian Assange who were actually pretty nutty conspiracy theorists, a lot of them. I was regularly attacked as president of the union for not doing enough by a lot of these people. I got a lot of online harassment because of this. There was an overlap with anti-vaxxers. You see some of the far right in the US who actually think that Julian Assange was motivated to support Trump over Clinton. I don't think that's the case. I think, like any journalist endeavor, they released information that they had, which may or may not have come from Russian intelligence sources, but they released information they had to get maximum coverage, and that was around Clinton and her emails. But I don't think there was an active support for Trump in that. But I think within those layers, if not in the center of the Assange crew itself, their opposition to US power and their identification of US power as the major force for evil, I suppose, the major force for no goodniks, lands, for many of them, though not all of them, it lands them in the camp of the idea that any of the US strategic enemies are our friends. So some of them are implicit, some of them explicit supporters of regimes in Damascus, in Moscow, in Tehran, in Beijing. But for most of them, it's more of a pursuit of what they call a multipolar world. This means they support the BRICS, they support the shift away from the US dollar as the major currency in the world. And they seem to think that having the major problem is that we have a unipolar world around US imperialism, and their political program is to push for a multipolar world that counters US imperialism. So their allies are not to be found in the world's working classes, but to be found in klepto and murderous regimes around the world, from Beijing to Tehran and Moscow. And I think this is obviously a false and dead-end program, but it is one that bubbles through a lot of this these campaigns. We see that in some, I think the audience here today knows that that is just a dead-end campaign and program. I mean, this week we've had the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting in Kazakhstan, with Putin was there, Xi Jinping was there. Interestingly, Modi did not attend but sent a senior spokesperson. I think that shows Modi is trying to keep a foot in both camps, through his involvement in what's called the Quad with the US, Australia, and Japan against China, but he's also got a foot in that camp. But one of the main themes of that meeting that's just finalised yesterday was for a multipolar world, which is exactly what these, I call it the anti-imperialism of fools. They believe that they're campaigning against US imperialism, but they're just creating a world that is drifting towards war. So, of course, for Marxists and consistent Democrats, Beijing, Tehran, Moscow, and Damascus offer no path for peace, for justice, for a world without war. We need to favour our own camp. The world's working classes are the only agent globally that can lead us to beyond a world driven by corruption and war. So the campaign to free Julian has been long and slow. From tiny numbers of isolated activists, I think there was a very successful smear campaign about a decade ago against Assange. I think as a personality, he's obviously a complicated person just from looking from the outside. Accused of having a messiah complex. I don't know enough about the guy. I've never met the guy to be able to pass judgment on that. But obviously very driven and one-eyed in terms of his project to reveal information about, and probably didn't build a lot of friendships along the way to do that. But the campaign to smear him, and I think there's still a lot of conspiracy theories around that. The fact that the US, when Pompeo was head of the CIA and then later Secretary of State, literally did hatch a conspiracy to either abduct or murder him, sort of does show that being a conspiracist in this area is not completely crazy. But I think there have been a lot of conspiracy theories around this, which makes it a mucky area to pass analysis. But for example, when I became president of the union, or even before that, it was to raise the issue of solidarity with Julian Assange. Most journalists and the union I'm in, it represents most mainstream journalists in Australia, similar to the NUJ in Britain. There was a lot of people who were saying, well, is he really a journalist? Should we really be bothering with him? And it was a particular part of my presidency to make sure that the union was full square behind the campaign to release Assange, warts and all, because it wasn't really about him. It was about the prosecution of journalism and a free press, and that's what it represented. Who controls information? Do the Whitehall, the Pentagon, the White House have a monopoly on who controls information? And I suppose that aspect of the program of WikiLeaks is one that we can share, that we are for transparency. We are for tearing up the secret pacts of the bourgeois states. So I think we do overlap in terms of the program, but we're under no illusions that merely the expression and release of that information will lead to a spontaneous uprising against imperialism. But from those very small numbers, we did manage to transform this into the beginnings of a mass movement in Australia in particular. We had ended up with a cross-party parliamentary group, include Conservatives, Greens, Labor Party members calling for his release. The Conservatives involved basically it was driven by nationalism, which you would expect. You know, Assange may be a rat bag, but he's our rat bag, and he shouldn't be in a US jail. He should be in an Australian jail. Was almost some of the conservative rhetoric. So this multi-pronged approach for release was both bottom up. It was about building mass movement, the demonstrations outside courts in London, the protests in the United States, people in the sun and the rain, you know, on the street campaigning. It never hit mass demonstration, but also there were it did start to become a mass sentiment in Australia in particular that he should no longer be in jail. And he was a symbol of journalism in jail for many. There was a similar parallel there was an Australian called David Hicks who trained with the Taliban just before 9/11 and ended up in Guantanamo Bay. He'd never fired a shot. He became radicalized, went to Afghanistan to train with the Taliban, got caught up in the post 9/11 US police actions against anybody involved, and was in Guantanamo, and he had to plead guilty to a minor terrorism charge and then was released. I'm not saying at all that Assange is a terrorist, but if you listen to some of the rhetoric of the US, including people like Clinton, including people like Biden, they did call him a terrorist, and that was the attitude of the US intelligence community to him. So getting him out was no mean feat. And look, the interesting thing I want to say finally about the Assange case is now that he's out, many of the Assangistas are sour at the credit being given to the Australian Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. Now, Anthony Albanese is getting a lot of credit for his release. Of course, he was dragged semi-unwillingly to the Assange case, although he was one of the few people in the Labor Party leadership who has been consistent for the last few years to have him freed. Many were very hostile. I know you have this culture in the Labor Party in Britain, but anyone to the left of you is just dismissed as a trot, and he's just seen as a trot. And that's just a catch-all for anyone, and therefore I don't have to engage with you. I just condemn you. That's like a curse word here as it is in Britain. But I would say that Assange would not have been freed in this way at this time if the ALP hadn't been in government. This isn't to say that the ALP has been squeaky clean on this, quite the contrary. But it shows an inadequacy in a lot of the anarchists and their understanding of power. They see all power as coming from the base up, which of course is hugely important as advocates of working class power. But also you need the salient of top-down power to get results. And I think in a quite a tortured way, the fact that it required the ALP in government, it probably required Biden in government as well. I don't know what Trump's attitude would have been. But anyway, I just wanted to make that final point on that, that you need a strategy that involves bottom up and top down in these power struggles. So second part, I'll be brief, Tina. Who owns information? I'm not sure the answer to this. So I'll throw this, it'd be interesting to hear what comrades think. Obviously, you want to, you can talk about knowledge capital, privacy, AI, and social media. We hear a lot about knowledge capital, but is that actually a form of capital in a Marxist sense? I'd like to know what you all think. Information and knowledge, of course, under capitalism are produced by capitalist firms as commodities. Petty producers, artists, musicians, freelance workers produce and sell information and knowledge. If you look at the media, which is where I've worked for 25 years, previous model was that capital owned a chokehold on the production of knowledge in the form of news media and used that as production leverage to create an audience for advertisers. And that's how they made millions and millions of dollars. That all got smashed by the internet. And now social media, primarily Google and Facebook, have hoovered those dollars up now. And you see mass sackings of journalists in the capitalist world as all that advertising money has shifted to the social media giants. I'll aim to finish at 5:30 or 5:30 in the morning here, whatever, 8:30 there, Tina. At the Sydney Morning Herald, where I used to work for a long time, we used to have a 5-story building that legacy media, mainstream media occupied all 5 floors. Google moved into the ground floor, then the first floor, and literally ate the building up from below. The Sydney Morning Herald was bought by another media organisation, and Google took over the whole building. So the CPGB draft program, I had a look at it on these questions, calls for the socialisation of internet service providers, public cloud infrastructure and other natural monopolies in communications, and an end to the corruption and advertising funded media. I mean, I think this is a good start, but I think given the international character of Google and Facebook, I think we need to have a broader and deeper program on this. The capitalist state has had no real way to respond. There's a bit of a crisis in information and media. Facebook and Google are now mass monopolies. I wrote an article a few years ago on this when Facebook banned news media in Australia, and they've done similar things in Canada. When the governments have tried to force these Facebook and Google to pay some money back to legacy media companies for the stories that they carry to get their own audience. And I thought of an analogy. In December 1883, a man called Gardner Green Hubbard was a businessman, lawyer, and founder of the journal Science and the National Geographic Society. He railed against a privately owned technology company upon which the great bulk of American business and political communication relied. Telegraph company Western Union had created the infrastructure and electrical public square of the Gilded Age of US capitalism, and with that came inordinate power. He wrote at the time, the importance of this business transcends its magnitude. For every political, general, or local item of interest is sent by telegraph, and upon this news, every daily paper depends for existence. Every important business transaction between parties at a distance and the most important and vital social communications are carried on by telegraph. He was deeply concerned that with this power, Western Union was a threat to American democracy given its control over the flow of information. This sounds pretty familiar. Today, Facebook and Google exercise similar monopolistic control over the huge volumes of electronic communication, information, and related advertising that are the lifeblood of the modern age. And as with the case of Western Union, their power is largely unregulated. In the US between 1866 and 1900, every elected Congress, save for one, considered legislation to tame Western Union's power. There were no less than 96 bills and resolutions brought before Congress that addressed the problem of Western Union. And during this period, Congress published 48 reports into the monopoly power of the telegraph company. That's more than one report a year, rivaling even the number of reports the Australian Parliament has put out into publishing diversity, digital platform and media ownership. So Hubbard called for Western Union's business to be handed over to the post office, to be nationalised effectively. All attempts to regulate the company failed. It wasn't until Hubbard's own company, Bell Telephone, eventually swept aside Western Union's dominance of communication. The last Western Union telegram was sent on the 27th of January, 2006. So I use that as an analogy because capitalism has no way to regulate Facebook and Google, and we can't nationalize them. I mean, I've heard Galloway and I've heard other sort of nationalist left politicians call for the nationalization. Some have advocated for a British search engine or an Australian search. I mean, it's just crazy autarkic nonsense. So the only path forward we have is internationalizing these controllers, not nationalizing them. And the only analogy that exists, I think, in the modern world is the way the internet has emerged. And if you look at the World Wide Web and so the back end of the web, the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, is run by Tim Berners-Lee. It's a global not-for-profit body that manages the structure and language of the web. So it ensures that a computer in Sao Paulo is able to communicate smoothly with a mobile device in Cairo. I think a similar model could work to manage global search functions, maps, information libraries, and other search engines. Wikipedia is also a successful non-commercial model. Such consortia could act as a model for a network of social platforms that democratically engage communities rather than treat them as a host from which to extract data to commercialize. And this also raises the question of privacy, which isn't in the CPGB program. Obviously, these massive institutions have access to a lot of our information. Facebook and Google can predict what we want for our birthday better than our partners probably can. And a lot of them will know our private peccadillos from our search engine history more than anybody else. This is massively, there's a lot of concern about privacy. This will exist also, I'd say, under socialism. In the EU, you've got the right to be forgotten law. And I think that's something worth examining and extending in some way, because under socialist society, we'll still want privacy. My final point is on, and I'm trying to pack in a lot here, artificial intelligence, which is also a dominant force now in these online search engines and online communities. We hear a lot of doom and gloom about human versus machine, that under AI, the humans, we get Arnold Schwarzenegger and Terminator and Skynet and all those memes. But of course, AI is just another form of capital. Like previous capitals designed to suck labour power from workers for private interests. This has taken a new technological form, but the fear that AI, machines will control humanity is just part of the ongoing horror story of capitalism. Marx said, capital is dead labour, that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labour and lives the more labour it sucks. So AI at the moment is sucking the intellectual property of authors, artists, musicians, and presenting it back to us as the original work of the machine. I know my union and the International Federation of Journalists and a lot of actors' unions, there was the big actors' strike recently around this issue. Under capitalism, AI will continue to rob us of our information and our creativity. And I would say it's only in a socialist and, Steve Freeman, yes, this is propaganda for communism. Only in a communist society under a global commune that machines can be used as tools to liberate us from drudgery. At the moment, lots of memes around saying, I want AI to do my dishes and laundry so I can focus on art, writing, and music, rather than AI producing all the art, writing, and music. While on some levels that's inane, there is a profound truth here about information, capital, labour, and freedom. And I will leave it there.
Thank you, Comrade. We're actually going to have a session on AI in September where we look into some of those issues in a bit more detail. That was a really fascinating look at some of the aspects that we don't usually talk about when we talk about Julian Assange. Comrades, do you have any questions or contributions, short ones? Because Marcus actually has to go to work now soon. We're gonna try to bring them in. I've got a couple of questions to get the ball rolling. You did touch on that, of course. Why is it being released now? And there was some chatter a few weeks leading up to it. You seem to locate it mainly in pressure from the campaign from the Australian government, rather than when you're looking at the reports here. It tends to be the thought was that the US elections are playing quite a big role, that Biden tried to take that bit off his plate and perhaps get the youth vote on board. How do you think in a priority of force?
Yeah, I think they definitely had. I think the Biden camp, because I'm not sure how much Biden is aware of these things, but anyway, I'm sure the Biden camp did not want to have a court case of a freedom warrior during an election that Trump could then use against Biden. I think that definitely played a part. So the other Yeah, the other aspect of the timing, of course, was that there was a really interesting article in the Washington Post soon after his release that legal advice to the US government was that they would lose in the British courts eventually. Now, this was also the thought of the Assange camp, that eventually they could win legally, but that might be in 2 years or 3 years, and they didn't want Julian. Julian was very unwell in jail, and they were worried about his health and his life. I mean, that he was in court reports reported as suicidal at times, which is not surprising given the amount of time he'd been in jail and the deprivation he'd faced. So I think those played into the timing as well.
Thank you. Another interesting issue was at the beginning, this question about truth and peace and war and lies, etc. I mean, you did touch on, that's a very simplistic way to look at wars, what wars are being fought over and how they're being fought over. And also, I mean, how many people will have actually read the WikiLeaks? I think this is not something that millions of people will read. How do you see the role of, say, communists like us interpreting the truth? How important is it not just to have it out there, but actually make sense of it? And that relates to the issue about media, whereas it's really important that we fight for the democratization, of course, of existing companies like Google and Facebook, etc. Clearly, we also have to build our own media and our own servers and our own channels, etc. How do you see that role of the mediation between truth and masses of people?
Yeah. So yes, most people have not looked at. I'd say most people, even in this discussion, haven't trawled through WikiLeaks information, but most people have seen the collateral damage. Not most. A huge chunk of the human population would have seen the collateral murder video of the Apache helicopter shooting up Iraqi civilians and journalists. That will be wide. I mean, that is an image that's as seared on human consciousness, really, as the napalm children from the Vietnam War. I would say it's a very striking. So yes. But the role of Marxists is to take information, interpret it, and take it through media and organisation. Ultimately, organisation is what counts, and unity around a democratic program for social change. And information can feed into that, but it's about having a democratic program for social change that is essential. That change will not come spontaneously, and I think that is the big difference between the program of enlightened anarchism. I'm quite sympathetic to anarchists. It's not meant pejoratively, but I think that's the difference between Marxists understanding history as social forces and the need for unity of the working class to achieve lasting democratic and radical change.
So it's interesting, the question of conspiracy theories, etc. And it is a tricky one. Here in the Labour Party, for example, there was a conspiracy against Corbyn. Clearly, there were people working together to get rid of him and to do the left in, etc. But of course, that's sort of without the organized left taking a lead on these issues and explaining it properly and fighting a proper fight. It's now common knowledge that Israel is pulling the strings of the Labour Party, etc. Rubbish conspiracy theories trying to explain a complex situation. Again, how do you see in terms of the role of Marxist communists to tackle easy answers to why is the US supporting Israel, for example?
So I think the fact that a lot of this information, such as US war crimes, British war crimes, everyone knows Blair lied, 45 minutes, everyone knows Blair lied. It produces a deep cynicism in people. I think that, so for people who aren't particularly engaged in politics, they just say, "Oh well, Blair lies. They all lie. Corbyn lies. They all must lie. Trump lies. Biden lies. You all lies. I'm just going to go to Tesco." You know, people just disengage, and it produces a deep cynicism in the working class. And I think that's, I mean, without being a conspiracist myself, I think that is part of the aim, is to create deep cynicism, so to stop effective social change. And I think this does take root in people who want social change, that they see everything as a conspiracy, that COVID was a conspiracy, that China must have released a virus, etc. Everything becomes a conspiracy. It's like the flip side of apolitical cynicism is this deeply paranoid conspiracy theory where, and some of it does veer into anti-Semitism on the left and the right, in terms of some of these conspiracies, but not exclusively. I mean, and I think Trump cynically uses this cynicism, and demagogues on the right cynically use that cynicism for their own purposes, like Farage, Brexit, and so on. I think you see that widespread.
Absolutely. Mark, please.
Yeah. Firstly, it's absolutely great that he got out. Delighted myself and lots of friends of mine who are not massively political, to be fair, but lots of people felt it was an injustice what happened to him. A few things. I've been writing obviously for about 20 odd years and getting paid for it. Sometimes well, mostly fairly poorly, to be fair. But even from the beginning, it was very, very difficult to get anything about the excesses of the military into the media. In 2002, 2003, I wrote an article for the Journal newspaper, which was about the heroism of British soldiers going back to secure the bodies of their dead comrades in the crater in Aden. And that got printed on the basis that the Journal would then follow it up with 3 further articles about the excesses which they then engaged in is retribution for their comrades having been killed. And all of those articles were pulled. The deputy in charge of the Journal newspaper quit on the spot, and the story has never, ever resurfaced in the last 21 years. It's slightly ironic. That's just as an aside. There's plenty of other stories I could go on and talk about in terms of the military, particularly some of the things that, of course, are then done to them. Gulf War syndrome, of course, was when people were actually poisoned as a result of organophosphates. It had nothing to do with military conflict. And most of the lads who had Gulf War syndrome that I worked with on that issue back in the early part of this century, they're long since gone, they're dead, even in their 40s and 50s, fairly fit blokes, to be fair. The irony about Wikipedia is itself its own restrictions on putting information was pretty prevalent. The reasons why I particularly faced this is that many of the stories which I tried to put on Wikipedia were stories that had actually broken. Some of them were political stories and some of them were football stories. But they have to be run through somebody who vets those stories. And if they didn't think it went with the norm that was on there, they basically just said, well, you're promoting your own work. And obviously my response to that was, well, it was my work that's proved these stories to be accurate and true, but nevertheless, they were just simply knocked back. Yeah, there's plenty of other stuff which I'd done in the big issue in the North magazine, which I tried to get onto Wikipedia, stuff which had even been as, you couldn't call it a bourgeois newspaper, but a newspaper of sorts. But sometimes you just couldn't get past the censors. But that aside, I'm full of praise for Wikipedia, and when the opportunity came up to put bits of money into it, I certainly did do so. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. Quickly, Steve Freeman, and then we're going to go back to Marcus, who has to go to work now. Steve.
Hi, Marcus. Yeah, very, very good, interesting talk, and giving us an Australian side to it, which is a missing thing for us over here. there's also a kind of British side to it as well in terms of campaigning that went on here and what we can learn about the way in which politics works in this country, which is really important. And we did election leaflet. I'm proud to say that it concentrated on Palestine and democracy, but we included Free Julian Assange. We had no idea at that point. In fact, during the course of the election campaign, because of our intervention, obviously, he was let out. So I don't think you've counted that in your analysis, Marcus. But our election leaflet, I think, possibly was a tipping point. But anyway, a couple of other points really. There was a big argument here, and you covered that as well, because Julian Assange lost a lot of support because some people looked at it about to be dealing with him as a person. Did this man do these things in Sweden or not? Was it a smear? Everybody went down that plug hole. It's not about a person. It's about the issues. That's the really important thing. And you could say, well, whether Julian Assange did or didn't do these things, it doesn't matter. He's being hammered because he is a journalist and he is exposing truth to us. And I think that's the important thing. And don't knock, and I don't think he did do that, but in a way, truth is revolutionary. So I think anything that exposes the truth raises consciousness, as in Pravda, truth and justice, of course, a famous name for baby. But as you say quite rightly, just because you're exposing truth, you can combine that with anarchist politics. You can combine that with Stalinist politics. It doesn't necessarily have a progressive thing, just merely in and of itself, truth and justice. But I think exposing the truth does raise people's consciousness about what the true state of thing is. Science, really, isn't it? It's a scientific approach to the world. And now my last point will just be this, Marcus. You're absolutely right. Certain problems, certain issues cannot be solved on a national basis. Capitalism is a global system, and many problems are part of a global system of power and can't be solved in any one country. I think that's it. And when you're talking about AI and things like this, then we're getting into that whole area that only global solutions can deal with those and national ones can't. But the but is, that doesn't mean, therefore, that all we can do is sit in one country making propaganda for a world solution. Well, you can do that, but you have to have a strategy for how to deal with the question of democracy in whatever country you happen to be in, whether that's Australia or whether it's here in the UK. And I think that most of the left don't do that, either pose the global thing or indeed pose the importance of democracy has got to be fundamental. And you said that, Marcus. It's not a disagreement with you at all. All right, thank you. And nice to see you again, by the way. Looking well, talking sense. Looking well and talking sense. Great.
Doesn't get much better than that. Okay. We're going to have to, can't bring any more contributions in now. So Marcus, would you like to reply to a few comments there?
Yeah, well, thank you. And if you're at Communist University this year, you'll get to see a bit more of me in person. I'll be coming. I think I'm not listed as a speaker yet, but I think I am giving a talk on philosophy and physics. And does matter exist? So you can have a think about that.
Of course it does.
Yeah, well, some quantum physicists don't think it does. But anyway, my day job is working with a lot of quantum physicists, and they've got some very interesting ideas, some of them. So yeah, I think I'll just pick up from Steve on consciousness raising. I mean, consciousness raising is an organizing tool as well. I mean, if you look back at the civil rights movement in the US, the anti-racist movement, overcoming internalized racism, comrades in the Black liberation movement, it was all about consciousness raising. What is the source of our poverty? What is the source of our lack of power, of our home, our shit homes, our bad jobs? I mean, so consciousness raising is hugely important, but it needs to be an organizing tool. You need to combine. If you don't combine information and consciousness raising with organization, I think you breed cynicism and you breed hopelessness and individualism and isolationism. If all you know is that the world is shit, why bother doing anything? If there's no hope, if there's no collective organization, if there's no like-minded people to feel the glimmers of freedom with, I mean, that is what we also do as Marxists. We're not just doomsayers at all. I mean, we're the ultimate in hope givers, aren't we? We're saying that only our program is the one that can lead us out of this shit. And I think that that is an important. It's very difficult to remain positive, but I think a democratic program for radical social change at the national level and international are hugely important. On this question of national versus international, I think any successful radical national movement where people with politics like ours came to power at a national level, you can imagine the opprobrium from the world's bourgeoisie. They would cut you off the internet if they could. There would be massive retaliation at an international level. So if you're democratic, I think that's even more the case now than in 1917 and the failed Russian Revolution. That if your program is not immediately international in some form, you will get crushed. And I think we have to be very cognizant of that, and we have to organize internationally because the speed of information is much greater. If a lie is halfway around the world before truth gets its boots on, as they say, that process is massively accelerated in today's information age, and we see that, and it's cynically used. And I think one of the positive things about WikiLeaks and why I think Julian Assange is a hero, despite, I mean, I don't know what his politics are like now after 14 years in jail. I think the guy just needs some time in the Australian bush looking at the horizon. I heard that when he was flying, he hadn't seen a horizon for 12 years. And his lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, who I know, said that he spent the whole time looking at the plane at the horizon because he hadn't seen one. I mean, and that level of personal deprivation is inconceivable. And that's why I called him a man in the iron mask. But so I don't know where his personal politics are now. But one of the I think the positive things of WikiLeaks is that it's a challenge to us Luddites in the Marxist movement. I mean, do you know of any Marxist organizations with a really professional online presence, with a really, really good understanding of online security, of being able to project well using modern information technology? I don't. We're really, really bad at it. And I think unless we get good at it, we're going to be stuck in online chat rooms of 42 people for a long time. And I think we need to be much more ambitious. And I think WikiLeaks challenges us to be ambitious. I mean, WikiLeaks hit billions of people. Billions of people began to have some consciousness raising because of the work of WikiLeaks. And it's that kind of elan and audacity of WikiLeaks that I think we should be inspired by and challenge ourselves to raise ourselves to that level of social engagement. I'll leave it there.
Very good last words, absolutely. And even just on the level of the internet and revolution, we've seen that they don't just switch off, the ruling class can switch off not just websites, it can switch off the whole bloody internet if there's a revolution happening. So unless we actually get our act together and form our own technical solutions as well as political solutions and professionalize our output, etc. I mean, this is really good, but it could be better, just a touch. So, but we have to take that seriously. Thank you very much, Mark. It's a really interesting view at some aspects of the Assange case that most people hadn't looked at, and from your perspective. So that was great. Please, comrades, join us next week. We're going to be joined by John Dunn from the Orgreave Truth and Justice campaign to review the film Strike, an Uncivil War. If you get a chance to watch it somewhere, please do. It is brilliant. It is really, really good. It's an excellent look at particularly the Orgreave picket that was crushed by the police, but puts it in a really important political context. We're also going to be looking at the book Citizen Marx by the author Bruno Leibold, who'll be joining us to discuss this in a bit more detail. So lots to look forward to. And, if you're staying up tonight, enjoy, or not, as it may go. The Not the Andromar show is on from, I think, 9:45 to have a live discussion on all the various issues. So thanks very much, Marcus. Have a good day, and the others have a good evening.